Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cynthia Benz, and on behalf of PMC's PCORI project team, which is made up of myself, David Davenport, who you've already heard from, Baswila Sampson, and Daryl Pritchard, as well as the rest of my colleagues at the Personalized Medicine Coalition. It's really my pleasure to welcome you to our second in the series of 3 roundtables to develop a patient-centered research agenda for personalized medicine. Next slide, please. So today's agenda is going to follow the same format as the one that we used for our first session on Friday. We did make some changes based on the evaluation forms that we received to allow for more discussion directly after our panels to provide more opportunities for our patient and participants to provide input and to share their thoughts. We know a lot of you joined for session 1, so in my brief introductions, I'm going to really emphasize the background for the project and reiterate our objectives for what we're hoping to achieve in this session and the session on Thursday. Next slide. And next slide. So we thought of seeking a PCORI Engagement Award because there are real gaps in evidence that are standing in the way of personalized medicine making its way into the healthcare system, and there are barriers to patients accessing personalized medicine, even when we are successful at making sure that, that systems are adapting to some of the rapid changes that we're seeing. We thought it's important to understand from the patient and caregiver perspective why this was the case and try to identify research topics that we believe, with your help, will begin to address these barriers that are experienced at the patient level. Because personalized medicine and patient-centered outcomes research share the same goal of shifting away from one-size-fits-all medicine to one that's tailored specifically to a patient's individual characteristics and circumstances, we believed it was valuable at this time to pursue the development and publication of a research agenda that reflects what patients want to hear from and see from their own experience with personalized medicine. So the principles that we've developed with various stakeholders that really underpin the potential research questions that you've received, that they were developed in a series of virtual sessions that we covered those principles in session 1. They were developed by patients, caregivers, patient advocates, and more than 70% of the responses we received to rank those questions that underpin the agenda for our discussions for the next 2 sessions were developed with patients, patient advocates, and caregivers in mind. So we really hope that what we're going to achieve is rooted in what we believe are the barriers that patients are experiencing or potentially will experience moving forward with personalized medicine. Next slide, please. So there are a number of different funding mechanisms that someone can apply for PCORI grant support. This project was selected by the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute to receive what's called the Eugene Washington Engagement Award. Because it's looking to not only elicit information from patients and caregivers, but it's also intended to establish partnerships and build a community that's equipped to participate as partners in advancing research for clinical effectiveness. Next slide. So we based the agenda and the objectives for this meeting on information that we received from our advisory committee. And I just like to reiterate what the objectives are for the roundtable, because I think that we had a really interesting and important discussion on Friday. Based on input from the advisory committee, the first purpose of the meeting is to look at the list of potential topic areas that have been circulated and refine the language in the proposed research questions in ways that are going to make them most impactful and relevant to patients. The second is to discuss suggestions for additional research questions that would improve patients' outcomes and experiences with personalized medicine. We believe we really started getting at some important additional questions during session 1. We're actually working on an additional question that we hope will capture some of the valuable insights we gathered on provider engagement and understanding about diverse populations. And I'm just going to read the question that we've developed. We will be sharing this with you, and it'll be up for discussion later. And we appreciate those of you who provided input on it already. The question is, how can healthcare providers engage in conversations and understand multiracial, diverse patient population due to historical issues and concerns which are grounded in mistreatment and lack of patience in personalized care and research? What current steps are healthcare providers taking to build trust with diverse populations to address those issues when deciding on personalized care or to enroll in a clinical trial? And after my introductory comments, I'll copy and paste that into the chat box so you all can see how it currently stands, and we welcome your feedback. Also acknowledging that the issues with underrepresentation in research is not the fault of the communities who are experiencing it. But we wanted to build some discussion into our third session on systemic problems with how research is conducted, who conducted the research, and who gets funding. We believe that has a place in the dialogue we're going to have on disruption in the healthcare system, and that'll be on Thursday. But we really hope to underscore the fact that because this type of award is intended to establish partnerships between patients who want to participate in research and the healthcare community, that this will potentially lay the foundation for some meaningful research questions that address some of the systemic problems. And then in addition, from session 1, we're also going to be adding 2 additional questions, though we're still working on the wording, and welcome your input on the role of telehealth in improving access to personalized medicine, as well as another question related to access to caregiver support services and how that could potentially improve a patient's care journey, particularly in pediatric rare disease populations. So we'll be sharing those with you as well. PMC really feels a great sense of responsibility to everybody who's participated in developing the patient-centered principles and also the potential list of research questions. And it's our hope that in today's session and the session on Thursday, we can really utilize the conversation to not only add questions, but also refine what we already have in front of us, because it's a really impactful list. And we all started from ground zero. And this was ultimately informed by patients, caregivers, and patient advocates. So we feel like we want to make the best of what they've already provided so we can deliver on our promise to them that our goal is to improve their care. If there are any major omissions like the ones that we discussed on Friday, please don't hesitate to bring them up. And the next slide. So this is just, again, a list of the roundtable participants. You'll see that it is a very diverse community. One of the things that we felt along the way is that during the discussion period, we do tend to hear quite a bit from healthcare providers, and we don't want to discourage that. But also we want to be sure that we're giving our patients and caregiver advocates the opportunity to share their thoughts. Susan's going to talk a little bit about how we're changing the structure of the discussion period, but please, everyone, we went through the ground rules for the discussion, and we want to be sure that that everyone has the time to weigh in with their thoughts to make this the most successful publication by the end of the project. And the next slide. So now I have the pleasure of turning it over to Susan McClure. She's going to moderate our second session. I'm not going to go through her extensive bio, but just to reiterate that Susan's the founder of Genome Creative, the first consulting firm in the nation focused on educating lay people about how our lives are changing through our increased understanding of DNA. She has both personal and professional experience with the topics that we covered on Friday and those that we'll continue to talk about. And she's a notable journalist, having founded and led both Cure Magazine and Genome Magazine. And she has experience serving on PMC's board of directors, and it's been great to work with Susan again on this. So with that, I'll turn it over to Susan.
Well, thank you so much, Cynthia. Can everybody hear me? Cynthia, nod, because you're the person I can see. So, okay, we're good. Well, again, thanks for that kind intro. I am so honored to be part of this initiative, and certainly I'm honored to be part of the PMC team in general. So as Cynthia mentioned, we had an incredibly passionate exchange of conversation around what patients want and deserve in terms of the care that they receive. We had that last week, and there are some remaining questions that we didn't get to discuss. And so I'm going to read those questions right now. And once I'm done with those questions, I would really like the patients in this group to unmute themselves and just basically let me know if they agree with these research questions as being part of this forward conversation. And so the research questions that we did not get to, and I'm not sure if they're on the slide or not, so I'm just going to read them. But what kind of new and existing educational tools and resources, including those using digital platforms, would empower patients and providers with varying levels of understanding about personalized medicine and its benefits to discuss personalized medicine treatment options during visits. The second one was how can patients and caregivers be encouraged to more actively participate in their personalized treatment when they prefer not to think about it, they want to rely on their trusted medical team, or feel inadequate to participate. Next slide. In conversations between patient and healthcare professionals about personalized medicine treatment options best address issues related to access and affordability of care. How can healthcare professionals and patients navigate language and cultural differences when discussing personalized medicine treatment options and delivering and receiving care? How do patients' needs and access barriers, including those related to cost and affordability, change depending on the purpose of a genetic test? Example, to identify a risk of developing a disease versus to identify an appropriate treatment. How can outcomes research in personalized medicine consider the impact of treatment on a patient's financial health, psychosocial well-being, and experience receiving care? So if patients could unmute themselves and kind of give me a consensus around this, whether you feel that these questions are relevant to your experience and should be included in future discussions.
Yes.
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 Yes. It's fine. I concur.
Looks good.
Eric with the FA, yes.
Yeah, seems fine. One thing for how to unmute.
Yeah.
Anyone else like to comment at this point before we move forward? All right, well, these are great questions, and thank you so much for your input. And if you have any more comments you want to take offline, obviously David and Cynthia are your people to address any wordsmithing of this. So yeah. Wonderful. So when I was doing my research before the launch of Genome Magazine, I was truly shocked to learn that treatments for many chronic and life-altering conditions don't work for the majority of people. In fact, I thought to myself, gosh, how would I feel about spending $60,000, $70,000 on a car that works 25 to 50% of the time? I really wanted to create a revolution. I wanted patients to better understand how our lives are changing thanks to our increased understanding of our own DNA. And I did what any journalist does. I launched a magazine so that we could have these discussions and educate people around this exciting time in healthcare. I have since learned how complicated it is to deliver care in a system that's built upon population averages. And so today we will explore practical considerations to improve the delivery of personalized medicine within the healthcare system. And we have an incredible lineup of people on the front lines who are reshaping the discussion within the healthcare space. And so I'd like to introduce those folks now. We have Jennifer Butte, who is a PhD Associate Professor of Communication Studies at Indiana University, Purdue, University Indianapolis. And so she will be first up. We also have Nadine Shinawi, who is a genetic counselor at the Heart and Vascular Genetics Program at Brigham and Women's Hospital. We have Lee Schwartzberg, MD, who is the Executive Director at West Cancer Center. And so I would really love to introduce Jennifer to share her thoughts around this topic. And so with that, I will turn it over to you, Jennifer.
All right. Thank you, Susan. I thought I would tell you a little bit about myself today and also about a health context that we have not spent a lot of time discussing in this group. I'm a social scientist by trade. As Susan mentioned, I'm an associate professor of communication studies, and I study communication about health. But I am also a food allergy parent. So I am the parent of a son who has had 2 anaphylactic reactions to food. The first of which was a reaction to a peanut. The second reaction was a reaction to a store-bought cake mix, and the exact trigger of that reaction is still a mystery to us. And it was that second reaction and the uncertainty and confusion surrounding that prompted me to become active in the food allergy community. So I've spent a number of years working with Food Allergy Research and Education, or FARE. That's a patient advocacy organization for food allergies. It's also the largest private funder of food allergy research in the US. You may or may not be aware that food allergies are increasing exponentially, and we don't know why. Food allergies are often thought of as a childhood disease, but recent research suggests that about half of adults with a food allergy were not diagnosed until adulthood. And there's no cure for food allergy. The FDA in September of 2019 just approved the first therapy for food allergy. It's an oral immunotherapy, also known as OIT, specifically for peanut allergy. And so there's a lot going on in this sort of evolving context that is highly relevant to the issues with personalized medicine that we have talked about as a group. So I have a vested interest in the role of shared decision-making and patient-provider communication and personalized medicine from both a personal lens and a professional lens. In the food allergy context, for example, shared decision-making between patients, parents, and healthcare providers is especially relevant in light of emerging therapies like OIT. For example, one current discussion that we don't have answers to yet is, should oral immunotherapy be standardized in terms of dosages, or would it be more successful if we were able to personalize dosages to each patient? One of the ongoing questions is whether we can predict the responsiveness to treatments like OIT. We know from clinical trials that some patients do better than others, but we don't know that until they've actually been through the therapy. So can we predict that up front? A huge issue in the food allergy realm is improving diagnostic processes, and personalized medicine, I think, could have a lot of potential to really make that process more precise. About half of food allergy test results from blood work or skin prick testing are false positives. So there's a very, very high false positive rate, and the gold standard for diagnosis is what's called an oral food challenge, which involves having someone eat a food that they are potentially allergic to and then waiting to see if they have a reaction, which, as you can imagine, causes a great deal of stress and anxiety for patients. And so can we use biomarkers to be more precise in diagnosis? Could we also use biomarkers to predict who's more likely to have anaphylaxis? Some people never have an anaphylactic reaction. They have mild reactions to food, but reactions can also be unpredictable in the same individual. So it's quite possible to have a mild reaction one time and then have your next reaction be much more severe. So there are lots of unanswered questions in this particular context, a context that might be a little different from some of the other health contexts that we have discussed thus far. I'm really excited to be a part of this group. Happy to answer questions about food allergy or about health communication, and also really excited to hear what other folks have to say today.
Susan, it looks like you're on mute.
Thank you, David. See, I'm following the rules. I'm trying to be quiet during the presentations. I wanted to say, if any of you have questions for the presenters as we're going through their talks here, you can ask them via the event chat button, and I will read them as they come up. Otherwise, we're going to continue on. We have Nadine Shinawi, who is a genetic counselor, as I said, with the Heart and Vascular Genetics program at Brigham and Women's. And so, Nadine, would you share your thoughts in minutes? I'd appreciate it.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So again, my name's Nadine. I am a genetic counselor currently in the cardiovascular genetics department at Brigham and Women's Hospital. And previously I did hereditary cancer risk assessment. As a genetic counselor, typically what I am responsible for is meeting with individuals, usually one-on-one, or they might have a family member with them, usually one time, sometimes two, sometimes three times. And the individuals who come to genetic counseling typically have a personal medical history or a family medical history that looks suspicious for a hereditary syndrome that is known at this time. And so what we do in session is talk through family history. We talk through the conditions that might be in the family, and then we talk through genetic testing options, how the individual feels about all of this information, and whether they want to know, what they want to know, why they want to know, and how comfortable they feel communicating with their family members about this information. And so that's all kind of encompassed in about 60 minutes usually. And outside of seeing individuals clinically, I also teach professional issues at the BU Genetic Counseling Program, which is essentially a course about topics that a genetic counselor might face in the workplace setting that aren't necessarily covered in like genetics courses or counseling technique classes. So things like ethics or like how a personal experience might impact how they talk with an individual or patient, what topics people are interested in individually, and how that could fit into their career. And then I also am on a number of committees and workforces that are aimed at increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion in the genetic counseling workforce and also the individuals we serve. So yeah, I'm also very excited to listen to everyone. And I did also want to mention that I believe I'm the only genetic counselor on the call, so there is a brand new issue of the Journal of Genetic Counseling, and it's going to come out in 3 parts. I was part of the editor team, which is why I know about it. But the issue is dedicated to minority health disparities in genetics and genomics. So there are a lot of really wonderful articles, and it sounds like that kind of emerged as conversation on Friday. So just a heads up.
That's wonderful, and it's great that you have that background and can really help us address those really important questions in this topic for sure. So we don't have questions popping up. So at this point, I'm going to move to Lee Schwartzberg because we're going to get to, we're going to have a robust conversation at the end of your presentations and really go through the principles again, the patient-centered principles that were outlined. And then we'll move into an open mic conversation where everybody will be able to really have a great dialogue. So with that, Lee, I am thrilled to introduce you as the Executive Director at the West Cancer Center, and we'd love to hear your feedback on this really important topic.
Thank you so much, Susan. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be part of the PMC and to help create some answers to these very important questions. I thought what I would do is summarize a little bit of the work we've done over the last couple of decades that impact personalized medicine as it relates to oncology. And I'll start by just talking a bit about my practice, which is the West Cancer Center. It's a community oncology practice that's been in existence for a little over 40 years now, and has had a research focus from its very initiation over time. cancer is arguably the field where personalized medicine has made its greatest mark to date. And that's not really a surprise because cancer is now known to be a genetic and genomic disease. So there are impacts of the germline or the hereditary aspects of what you're born with in terms of gene abnormalities that might predispose you to a cancer. And every cancer that does develop is essentially the sum of a particular group of mutations and alterations in the DNA that leads to abnormal functioning of cells. So in every cancer, there is a genomic element, and in some cancers, there's a genetic element that patients are born with. So given that background, we actually started in this endeavor back in 1997 when the first commercial test became available to test for the breast and ovarian cancer syndrome genes, BRCA or BRCA1 and 2, and actually set up our first genetic counseling program back in that era. So we have quite a bit of experience in counseling patients, mainly at the beginning, patients who had strong family histories of breast or ovarian cancer, and then testing those patients to see if they carried one of the hereditary genes. And in doing germline testing, as Nadine does also in cardiovascular, we have the further implication of the rest of the family, which makes for very interesting dynamics between the provider, the patient, and the family, and one that we've had to work through over the years. And in relation to one of the questions, the research topics that we're going to discuss, we do occasionally, or used to be relatively frequently, pick up what are called variants of unknown significance, where it's not a simple yes or no. Yes, it's a gene that could be bad and increased risk for cancer, or no, your gene looks normal, because everyone has variations in our genes, and we don't know the exact information from the spelling of every one of our genes yet, even these very important cancer susceptibility genes. So we have sometimes uncertainties, and that can cause stress for individuals. That's gotten better as we've tested more people, but it's still an issue, and it's particularly an issue for populations where there has not been a lot of testing. In certain ethnic or racial populations, it continues to be an issue. So I'll just flag that as one. The second of three areas that I just want to highlight is what's called genomic profiling for risk of cancer, of recurrence of cancer. And this began in earnest in the mid-2000s with the development of commercial tests in breast cancer that could tell you in particular types of breast cancer what the risk was of the cancer coming back, number one, or prognosis. And there are now several tests that do this, and they're all quite good with very high levels of evidence of being prognostic. And some of them are also predictive of whether or not chemotherapy will help patients. And I think we'd all agree, if you don't need chemotherapy, you don't want to take it. And I totally agree with that as a medical oncologist. And so what these tests have led to, interestingly, over the last 15 years since they've been available, is less use of chemotherapy, a true win for personalized medicine in oncology to give patients the correct treatment in breast cancer. And to a certain extent, these tests are also available for other cancers. But there remains quite a bit of work to be done here. And what I've learned, and one of the questions that I think would be great to discuss, is communicating risk to patients who have had their cancer taken out, which is the situation we're talking about in this instance, and trying to contemplate what the numbers mean for them personally. This is a very difficult aspect of care in my experience. Having the genomic profile and a specific number or range helps, but it makes it's a very complicated issue in terms of communication, and I believe we need more research and work around that. And finally, the third area I'll just tee up is what we're now in a new era of for cancer, which is the use of the genomics that I talked about. That meaning what an individual's cancer looks like, not under the microscope, which is of course the first step in diagnosing cancer in every instance, but what it looks like molecularly. What are the drivers? And you can have 100 cancers that look alike under the microscope, each of which has characteristics unique to it. And so when we look at cancer genomics, it really, in my mind, reflects the true meaning of personalized medicine or precision medicine, precision oncology. What we would like to do is tailor treatments individually to those patients. That's a long way from the old era of chemotherapy, which was given across the board, a very blunt instrument, if you will. We're trying to be very precise now. And we've made quite a bit of progress, although there's a vast amount more that needs to be made in terms of having drugs now that are specifically targeted against a particular alteration in one gene or a few genes in a particular patient's cancer. Now, the challenge there is also a communication one, but not only with the patients who, particularly the use of this is in the advanced cancer space. So we're talking about patients who have advanced or metastatic cancer. Usually those are diseases that cannot be cured, and therefore these patients are struggling with existential issues. You know, how well are they going to live? How long are they going to live? What's the next best therapy for them? Should they go on a clinical trial? All of these questions weighing heavily on everyone's mind, as well as the caregivers who often have to participate quite heavily in the patient's well-being and treatment. So we have the issue of understanding the precision medicine piece of cancer treatment within the context of the total piece of cancer treatment. But we also have a challenge with our providers because the information is coming so fast and furious that it's impossible for any one individual to keep up with everything. And that is particularly a challenge for community oncologists who tend to treat multiple cancers as opposed to academic clinicians who tend to focus on one type of cancer. Given the fact that about 3/4 of patients are actually treated in the community by people who are so-called generalists, we must find ways to communicate to our providers as well as our patients so they understand how to boil down the vast amount of information that's coming from these genomic tests today into actionable bite-sized pieces that will best help their patients. So that's another question that we had as a research topic, and I'll just tee it up in the context of what we've been doing for the last 10 years in terms of doing cancer genomics on a wide scale now.
That's wonderful, Lee. And I think it's so important to have you here today to really address the perspective from a community oncology perspective, because really that's where so many people are being treated, and the complexities there are very different than they are in the academic setting. We have a couple of questions that have come up. The first one's from Joan Powell, and she asked, when you have a rare blood disease, is it encouraging to perform genetic testing on patients? So that is the first question. I'll let you tackle that one, Lee.
Yes, I believe that for rare blood diseases in particular, it is absolutely essential to perform genomic testing, and there are various levels of genomic testing. Frequently, for people that have an unusual abnormality in their blood, the diagnosis is made molecularly. Sometimes it can be very difficult to use the traditional tools like looking at the blood under the microscope or using standard lab tests to make those diagnoses. Increasingly, for diseases that are almost every blood disease, malignant blood disease in particular, such as leukemias, lymphomas, multiple myeloma, myeloproliferative disorders, things like that, Doing a comprehensive genomic panel has been worthwhile because it helps define the prognosis as well as increasingly define particular drugs that may be of use. And one of the wonderful things that's happened in the last couple of years, both in blood cancers as well as solid tumors, has been the development of a number of new targeted agents that are very specific, but conversely only work on small populations of people with a particular disease. So the concept that we're subdividing cancers into small subgroups, so there's not just acute leukemia. We define it by what it looks like under the microscope, but we now also define it by there's different mutation types, and they all behave differently and have different drugs, making it more complicated. But when you find those mutations, very effective treatments.
Jane Binger asks, how can we help patients and families know what to focus on and what not to focus on as they learn about personalized medicine and negotiate the use of this modality with their caregivers or family members' caregivers? And more specifically, how can we help patients and family members learn about relevant personalized medicine testing and treatment modality in an ideal order to avoid wasting their time and overtaxing their coping mechanisms? So I would pose that to you, Lee, and even Nadine. Maybe you would like to speak to that as well.
Thank you. I'll start, and I will say this is a central question. This is a very difficult question because the proliferation of personalized medicine testing is growing day by day. The number of companies that are entering this space is enormous, and not every test is equal. Totally agree with the intent of the question. It's very difficult. And also, some of the results, many of the results, are indeterminate in the sense that we may find an abnormality, but we really don't know what the clinical implication of that is. So I think this is a dialogue between the provider and the patient. I think at the very least, patients can query their providers to make sure they are aware of personalized medicine in their particular domain, whatever disease the patient is seeing them for and making decisions with, and try to get a sense that there is a familiarity, because one of the main, I would say, functions of a provider is to try to, whether it's personalized medicine or not, is to try to separate the wheat from the chaff for the patient and to focus on what's most important. Not every provider has equal bearing in personalized medicine. Much of it is very new. It requires keeping up, and it's important to make sure as a patient that you feel comfortable that your provider either has the answers or is willing to get them.
Thanks. Nadine, would you like to comment?
Sure, I can add a little bit in terms of kind of the front end of that question. What could individuals focus on? And what first comes to mind as a genetic counselor is that so many conditions might appear in a family over and over again. And some of those conditions are multifactorial, meaning have a whole array of genetics that might. Can you hear me again?
Yeah, we can.
Okay. I think, can you still hear me? Because my thing says I'm muted.
We hear you.
Okay, great. So multifactorial conditions have a whole array of genetics and then also like environmental components. And a lot of those conditions we don't have genetic testing for quite yet. There's a lot of research going on, certainly, for kind of looking across someone's genome for like certain spots that might be contributing. But then there's this other pool of conditions that are hereditary, and those do often have genetic. And so for someone to know whether their family history looks multifactorial or hereditary, I wouldn't expect someone to know that. What I would hope that someone might be able to do is to know their family history as much as possible. There's so many barriers to knowing one's family history, but that is definitely the number one way of a person, even just knowing your family history, you might be able to establish what patterns are showing up. Is it heart? Is it cancer? Is it blood disorder? And there are different tools online. The Genetic Alliance comes to mind to help people have those conversations with family to get family history. And then I would say knowing family history and then asking a provider, hey, I noticed multiple people in my family have this. Is this something I should get genetic testing for? Your provider may or may not know, but at least posing the question will encourage them to look up the answer, so that you can learn whether a referral or genetic testing is available, or whether research is being done on that particular condition.
Thank you, Nadine. And Jennifer, do you have anything to add on that one?
I would add, in terms of family history, we do know that despite tools that are available, such as those that Nadine mentioned, families have a very hard time discussing those topics. They're reluctant to talk about it. Some of that varies according to culture, for example, and the way that health is talked about and treated. For instance, in some circles, it's considered almost bad luck to talk really explicitly about serious health conditions. So it is a challenge for patients to know their own family history sometimes.
That's a great comment. We have a couple of more questions. Dr. Polly, I am going to reserve yours because I think there's a very specific research question that addresses your comments. Mike, you said we represent a rare neuro disease, SYNGAP1 flow sufficiency. It is one of a rapidly increasing numbers of such rare disease. Not only is the number growing, but they are starting to subdivide as cancer has done. What can we learn from cancer as we start to tell our families that personalized medicine is coming, even though it is not here yet for our disease? How do we support families? How to support the genetic counselor? Great question. Who would like to tackle that one?
I can start. This is Lee. This is a great question. And I think there are still frustrations. So in some ways, and this is really important for this panel and for framing the research questions, I'm worried that we might, through personalized medicine, accentuate the divide between the haves and the have-nots for a couple of reasons. Some of that will be financial in nature. And I see there are some questions about reimbursement for these tests, which are good ones, which we can tackle in a bit. But some of it is informational. So as I mentioned before, if you don't know what to ask, then it doesn't get asked and the test doesn't get done. So that's one of the issues. The other frustration is for the haves and have-nots is we can say, and we're still at the point in cancer, and I suspect further behind in other diseases that are genetic or genomic, that we can test people, and if you have a positive and then you have an answer, that's great in a way because it imbues you with actionability and some understanding of a process that was completely out of your control. The other side is people who get a test that's negative when, and especially when that's just a minority of the population, and as we move on, it gets to be, then they feel a greater sense of frustration. Oh, I did this personalized medicine test and it didn't even help me. So we need to have a path forward for those individuals and an explanation about the current limitations of any given test to be able to distinguish somebody with a known alteration that we can test for and those that we still don't have the information about yet.
That's great. I'm going to go through one more question, and then we're going to read the principles once more and then dive into these research questions. So Lawrence has a question. What's the role of research on testing in regards to the process of getting insurance companies to recognize the utility of a test and agree to reimburse for it? Now, there's a big question to tackle.
Well,
Lee,
I
I
don't
can go.
yeah. Who wants to take that one, Nadine or Lee?
Sure, I can talk a little bit about that. Probably every individual I see asks some variation of that question. More, there's a lot of question of, is genetic testing research-based, like the testing I discuss with individuals, or not? Because if it's research-based, then typically it doesn't go through insurance, and so it can kind of go on its way without insurance knowing about it or hackling someone. And then I'd say clinical genetic testing, there is actually a lot of financial aid or help from the testing labs themselves. There's so much competition among these laboratories that I feel like they have to get on board with being able to handle the financial questions. And so, for example, the three main labs that we use in the Boston area and really across the country, probably, yeah, I'll just say across the US, other countries have access as well, but I think it's harder. They will not give a patient a bill that's over $100 unless they call, and $100 can be a lot for many individuals, of course, but it's not $5,000, and I think that's what people come in thinking they might get charged without informing the individual, offering different payment plans. Most of these labs have a cap of a patient pay price of somewhere around $200 to $300. So I think, first of all, just knowing that there are already things in place that can help, that cost of a genetic test should never make a provider not refer someone, because there are many strategies to figure out the cost. And then I also think the cancer setting there are more insurance policies that at least talk about their coverage of cancer genetic testing, and usually you have to meet certain criteria, and usually the individuals who are getting genetic testing meet that criteria, and usually it gets covered. And so many things come to mind, but two other things. In the settings where there aren't those guidelines written by the insurance company, it does tend to fall more on the provider to advocate for the test being necessary, being worthwhile, explaining why that is. And a lot of those answers can come from research studies. So if research proves that there's an effective treatment for a certain genetic alteration, then that gives a provider some proof that they can share with the insurance company. And then I would say, lastly, the genetic testing laboratories, other than being able to handle billing in a way that's patient-friendly and doable, the technologies really can be streamlined in certain ways that are much more cost-effective, so that they don't need to charge insurance companies thousands of dollars when their technology actually, it only costs like $200 to run the genetic test. So
that's great. Lawrence also asked, what is the role of research on testing in regards to the process of getting insurance companies to recognize the utility of a test and who reimburse for it?
I think that research testing, in the realm of research genomic testing or testing the genes themselves, can help to convey that the genetic test itself can pick up mutations that cause the disease. So there has to be research that goes into that to be able to say this gene, and this gene all contribute to cardiomyopathy. You can't just test one, you have to actually test all three of these. So that comes from research. And then also a targeted therapy or prevention strategy typically needs research. So once you know that someone has a certain mutation, trialing a therapy, finding that it is effective or not, can help to get insurance companies to feel convinced that might be saving money by doing the genetic test versus the health condition that might come down the road.
Lee, did you want to add at all?
Yeah, sure. So just to add to Nadine's very nice description, with the genomic tests and genetic tests that have been available in cancer, which sort of have developed over time, a number of clinical utility studies, cost effectiveness studies, and budget impact studies have been done, which help to get payers on board with paying for the test. And the challenge tends to be, you're getting all this information. It's definitely getting cheaper, as Nadine said, but in some cases, particularly for these broad genomic panels of cancer, they still may be several $1,000s. And so we have to do the studies prospectively that show that we're using the test, we're making a decision.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that Trish muted her mic, but she did. Okay, we're good.
Okay. So the aspect of clinical utility, meaning that you use the test to make a treatment decision, and in general, your decision, if you did not have the test, would have been fractionally different, so that it actually makes an impact on how you treat the patient. Generally speaking, those kinds of research data are, if they're meaningful enough differences, payers will move on to pay for those tests. I will say one of the things that's curious to me in cancer is that the average targeted therapy has a list price today of over $100,000, and to do the genomic test to see if you would qualify for that, I'm just talking list price here, is $5,000. In reality, they're usually a couple of $1,000s, and to the patient, not more than a couple $100, as we heard for genetic testing. But some payers are still balking at paying for the single test, but it's mainly because in not every case has the clinical utility been demonstrated, and they're being sticklers.
I think that's a great comment. Thank you guys so much for your thoughtful comments. I am going to move along here because we have so much to go through with in getting to these research questions. A little over a year ago, the following set of principles were created by a patient community led by the PMC, and these principles are the framework for creating compelling research questions and topics to improve the delivery of personalized medicine to patients. And because they were developed a while ago, I want to refresh everybody's memories and read through them quickly. I think they're on slides. There we go. So the first principle is patient and caregiver values include personal priorities, religious, spiritual values, societal and cultural values, including family involvement in care decisions, views around quality of life, privacy concerns, desired level of access to and understanding of personal genetic information, beliefs about health and personal responsibility, and attributes and preferences toward end of life. Second one, patient and caregiver circumstances include emotional state, socioeconomic situation, race, ethnicity, sex, gender, language, health literacy, ability to work, access to care, access or lack thereof of a caregiver, Our social support, cognitive abilities, attitude toward illness, example, acceptance of a diagnosis, willingness to accept help, personality, symptom burden, health-related quality of life, ability to consent and choose, relationship with the healthcare provider, the role of patient as a caretaker, preferences of family members, treatment setting, community versus academic and other, familiarity with personalized medicine and its benefits, other social determinants of health, and other expressed needs or barriers. Next slide. The research agenda would be most helpful if it focused on priorities that help providers in identifying and communicating treatment options based on biological differences, context of patient caregiver values, B, understanding patient caregiver circumstances and presenting treatment options in ways that highlight how a treatment aligns or does not align with those circumstances. Potential for shared decision-making tools and resources to facilitate these conversations should be explored. Next slide. Research agenda should address the education of patients directly by considering the education of patients and caregivers as a continuing process over time, not just at diagnosis, including basic education defining personalized medicine and its benefits, B, how both patients, caregivers, and their providers can improve communication with each other, and how to close the gap between patient-caregiver expectations, reality of how and when test results and treatment options are delivered. Educational tools and resources, including those available online, should address different learning styles and levels of health literacy. Next slide. Number 5, opportunities to educate providers in genomics should be considered, along with providers' varying levels of understanding of genomics and varying levels of access to new and existing resources, such as translational tools, depending on their health setting, community, academic, or other, health specialization and health discipline, example, pharmacists, physician assistants, genetic counselors, nurses. This includes opportunities to educate providers and other healthcare professionals in training. The agenda should consider how to use oncology as a prototype for patient and provider education in these areas, in these disease areas beyond oncology. Next slide. Number 7, access challenges beyond those created by lack of communication and education should also be considered. This includes timely access to novel and or off-label therapies as a result of affordability, insurance coverage, and provider availability. Number 8, the research agenda should be representative of diverse patient needs, diseases, backgrounds, and experiences, example, stage of life, disease trajectory, socioeconomic status, and health literacy levels, including patients underrepresented in medical research. Specifically, the research agenda should apply across disease areas. This includes considering how the research agenda can apply to additional disease areas as new personalized medicine treatments come to market. This includes potential research topics related to the management of comorbidities. Next slide. The advisory committee should consider the areas the agenda must include and exclude to have the greatest impact, including the feasibility of the proposed research topic. This includes potential research topics related to artificial intelligence, data collection, data integration and interoperability, informed consent, and patient consent related to data privacy and access. Next slide. So now we get to the meat of today's research questions in session 2. I would ask everybody at this point, well, the patients especially, to unmute their mics right now because we're going to take patient comments for these research questions first, and then we're going to open it up to patient advocates and then everybody. So I'm going to read all of session 2's research questions, and then we're going to go through them one by one and get your feedback on each one specifically. And so we'll start with how can the roles of other healthcare providers beyond a patient's physician such as nurses, nurse navigators, genetic counselors, and pharmacists, be maximized to improve the delivery of personalized medicine? Second question, how can barriers for physicians and their medical teams in discussing and sharing with patients and caregivers How can barriers for physicians and their medical teams in discussing and sharing with patients and caregivers information on personalized medicine, including testing, patients' results, treatment options, and enrollment in clinical trials, be addressed? What strategies should be used to improve the knowledge and expertise of primary care providers in the integration of personalized medicine into clinical practice? Next slide. What kinds of tools and technologies, example, clinical decision support tools, could be made better available to providers in varying health settings, health disciplines, and health specialties to improve the delivery of personalized medicine? How can conversations between a patient and healthcare professional about personalized medicine treatment options best account for shared decision-making? How can shared decision-making tools and resources better facilitate conversations between patients, providers about how personalized medicine treatment options align, do not align with patient caregiver values and circumstances? How does a patient's and a healthcare provider's understanding of genomics, including the patient's understanding of his or her own genetic information, impact the integration of personalized medicine into clinical care? Finally, what mitigating strategies are needed to address inequity in the proportion of variants of uncertain significance reported out for individuals of non-Western European ancestry ethnicity compared to those of Western European ancestry ethnicity? And so with that, patients, would you please unmute your mics, and we're going to start with that first question. So the question is, how can the roles of other healthcare providers beyond a patient's physician, such as nurses, nurse navigators, genetic counselors, and pharmacists, be maximized to improve the delivery of personalized medicine? Who would like to comment on that question and basically weigh in on whether that is a relevant include in these topics?
This is I think it's training and education. I'm not a oncology patient.
And you're breaking a little bit.
My that I'm educated doesn't seem to be aware about. Can you hear me?
You're breaking up a little bit.
I can. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now, yes.
There must be something. Can you hear me now?
You're still breaking up, Joan. Maybe you might want to type your comments in the event chat since you're.
You can move on to the.
Okay. Who else wanted to participate? I saw Brad Power jumping in there. Other people who wanted to comment on that first question.
Yeah, this is Brad Power. Can you hear me?
Yes.
My comment would be, and it kind of cuts across all these, that the team that is required in the current state of personalized medicine has to include machines and humans. So it's like the role, and I would make, so there's primary care, community oncologists, and academic oncologists. So I would make the distinction. I think 90% of people get their care through a community hospital oncologist, not at an academic research medical center. And so it's kind of, you would, the list of things or people and things that I would include in that trusted team then would be the primary care the community hospital oncologist, the academic center oncologist, all with varying degrees of knowledge. And because the field is changing so fast, and particularly for primary care or for community oncology care, they're only going to keep up if they have augmentation from an AI, from a tool that helps them keep current and keep them to the level of sophistication that's required for the rapidly evolving state of medical knowledge. And the tailoring and personalization is more than any human can keep up with, particularly if you're dealing across multiple kinds of cancer. So that's it's sort of overarching because I think it touches on the first question and a number of the other questions. I'm looking at number 8 here. It's kind of like healthcare professionals plus the machines, the tools and the augmentation, the AI, the information systems that will help guide and augment the expertise of the humans.
Mm-hmm.
Who else wanted to comment? Candace?
Hi. Yes, I was agreeing because, most, especially with low-income clinics and hospitals, access to that type of ability is very limited unless they have a connection with a research hospital. And so when that question is of how can the roles of healthcare professionals beyond patients and physicians, I would also say maybe grant some programs that would allow primary care physicians to allow mechanisms in their office to keep up, because when they don't have access, their patients don't have access. Does that make sense? So I guess it would start with primary care, and if they're not being referred or they don't have access to the information for the patients, then that's where the limitation begins.
Hi, this is Laura Homestead. Can I add on to that?
Yes.
Hi. So I think I agree with both Brad and Candace, and I think my comment kind of falls down the middle, that what I hear from both patients and then from talking to oncologists at CCCs is that for patients, once you have if you get the access to a community oncologist, then allowing and empowering patients to ask about these genetic tests and other tests that might be available, but also encouraging them to seek second opinions, which I hear over and over and over again from patients at every age group. We feel uncomfortable. We feel like maybe we're not supposed to get a second opinion. And most often a second opinion will offer some sort of insight that might change care. And on a similar vein, from oncologists at CCCs, I hear they are seeing and receiving these patients too late, because if they had been able to seek a second opinion at a CCC earlier on, their care would be much different.
Thanks, Laura.
This is Diane Medizian. I have a couple comments that also go across the questions and maybe leave out or point to a question that we're not asking, which is I think there needs to be some general education. I mean, it all goes back to education. And the best time to learn something is not necessarily when you're sick and vulnerable. So I think there's a bigger question here about making the idea of precision or personalized medicine known. There needs to be a community-wide campaign that the people have even get familiar with the term and comfortable and understand it. So that's one thought. The other thing is, whenever something is new like this, it seems like that we need, because we know from research that it takes so long for new practices, even once they've been approved by the medical guidelines groups. It takes so long to make it into the physician's office and for the physician to get comfortable. It seems like there needs to be a checklist or a script or a list of questions that need to be followed. I mean, a few years ago, checklists were very popular in medicine, and they were proved to work. So just like now, we ask anyone that goes into a new doctor or the emergency room, do you feel like anyone at home is, hurting you, or is, those questions about abuse? Why can't we build this idea of precision and personalized medicine into the whole approach we take to medicine? Because sooner or later, it will become medicine. We know that. This is the way medicine will be practiced. How do we instigate that and make that happen more easily now? So some of these tools like the checklists and the scripts and the prior education before you get to the doctor's office will help both physicians and patients. So that's what I wanted to say.
Hello, this is Marcela from the National Alliance for Hispanic Health, and I'm glad Diane mentioned the role of education, because that's one of the areas that we, to support our communities, is always a great need to do it, and especially in this type of subject matters that are a lot more difficult. I mean, it's one thing, the access is another thing, to actually understand what you're going through, or what you need to ask your providers, or the type of resources that are available for the patient to take advantage of. And when it comes to issues such as genetics, and those are difficult topics. So education is definitely key, and I'm glad the role of navigators, counselors, and definitely community health workers are also key for this type of activities. And especially we want to provide education at the community level. Please, definitely include community health workers, promotores de salud, and work in conjunction with community agencies as well, so they can actually provide a lot more support. And this is an example of what we're doing right now with the All of Us research program. We're partnering with community-based organizations around the country, so they can educate the community about Hispanic communities about this opportunity of this the research program that is going on right now. But it's definitely key, the education, because people want to know, people would like to know actually, and they are interested in this type of things. But if we don't provide the information, and also provide the information that is actually culturally and language appropriate as well.
I'd like to just briefly follow up on that. I think when it comes to developing these educations and disseminating information on personalized medicine, I think it's really important to have disease group organizations, advocacy groups, and like the CF Foundation and these cultural organizations for minority groups, providing this information and to patients and to providers as well. I don't think it can be just the responsibility of providers solely to, do all the research and coordination for providing this information and strategies for obtaining personalized medicine. It's definitely a group effort. So I think it's important to have, a body that advocates on behalf of diseases and these cultural groups, and by providing like step-by-step guidelines, as Diane was saying, this checklist, online resources for patients, and providing as much information as thus far is available in this new realm, and obviously equipping patients with knowledge about their own health and the treatment options is the best way to motivate them to continue seeking new information and feeling comfortable with participation. And I think for providers, having it be a part of continuing education training And that's the way that also providers can get more information, because it's continuously evolving. As new testing becomes available, I think it's vital to be up to date. So, and especially now with the era of COVID, as a whole, I think we are getting more used to digital resources and communications, and so maybe having like webinars and things, online in nature are, I think more and more people will be receptive to that. So those are just ideas.
Dr. Pally, I wanted to go to you because I know you had some comments.
Yeah. So let me be very clear what is happening in the medical world, and that might help a lot of people. Diane, your comments hit me directly on the head, and I'm going to tread between your comments and Dr. Strasberg as an oncologist. I do primary care, and I also do genetics. And the simple reality is that we're in a situation where there's a huge chasm, a split between the general medical community who have insufficient training and knowledge of genetics and how to proceed down that area, and some patients who know something about it, or advocates, and many who don't know who to ask or what to ask. So Diane, I'll focus first on your comment, which hits me directly. Why don't people talk more about it? Because there's another conundrum between the imaging studies world and genetics world. It's really easy to ask your doctor, do I need an MRI? You do or you don't. He or she orders it or they don't. And it gets covered or it doesn't. The problem in genetics is that if you ask your provider and if they are insufficiently knowledgeable about training, or equally, if there are not sufficient genetic trained individuals in their vicinity, which is extremely common in these United States of America, you've now opened a difficult conversation. So if you're in both primary care or other specialty areas and not doing medical oncology like Dr. Strasberg, who I'm sure is doing a wonderful job on focused patients who tend to have diagnoses that need assistance, once a dialogue begins on genetics, it's both complex, extremely time consuming, and it leads to like another visit, which can be difficult for the providers, be they PAs, NPs, or physicians to have. I'm not telling what you want to hear. I'm telling you what's out there. This is the hard reality that we have encountered in New Jersey, where I've had 10 years now of doing a genomics program, where the first focus for the first 4 years was to train the physician community on genetics, and we've essentially given up. We can't really seem to achieve the ability to get the average physician in the community to add 2 to 25 minutes to a visit that is difficult. And now we mentioned the COVID environment. It's just very difficult. I'm not being negativistic. I'm an optimist. I think it will change, but the things that will change is better training, better patient advocacy and awareness. People have to ask their doctor, do I have a genetic issue to be discussed? I don't want to go on too long, but I want to give an example that always hits me in the head when I lecture constantly. Some people have an elevated platelet count, and it looks benign. Dr. Strasberg may know where I'm headed with this and other oncologists on this call. If a physician or provider doesn't ask the question, should I get genetic testing? These are asymptomatic individuals, and if you don't order a certain test or the JAK2 or Janus kinase 2 test to determine if they have this condition, then the question will not be asked, the test will not be obtained, of which the treatment is pretty much baby aspirin or hydroxyurea, a certain medication that's relatively benign. But the point I'm just making to a lot of lay people on this call, if you don't ask the question, you won't get the answer. And if the providers don't ask genetics questions, they won't have that possibility. It's hard to correct. The research questions you're asking are a way to do that, but it really has a lot to do with a change in the curriculum in medical schools and in residency. And in addition, caveat emptor, buyer beware. If the public asks about genetics testing, it will force the curriculums at training programs to engage more directly. Sorry, I don't mean to pontificate, but I'm passionate about this subject, and it's very difficult, and it's one of the reasons we don't get out of this conundrum. Genetics is complex, and it's hard for a lot of providers to understand it, and I get it. I get it. but it doesn't mean you don't ask the question and locate. Today, the genetic counselors on the call know that telegenetics is available. There are options to do this. I'm sorry, Susan, I went on too long. I apologize. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a
And I actually would like to agree and actually extend it also to not just the clinician, not just the physicians, but also to nurses and nurse practitioners for learning and making sure that it's in their curriculum. I had the experience of teaching nursing classes as well as pre-med classes, and some of them don't get it. Why do they have to have genetics? And it's so important because they will see the patients and will be, in the liaison of the care team with the patients. So it's definitely education is of the medical community in addition to the public and the layperson to ask about biomarker testing and genetic testing is so important to get into the conversation.
Can I just add one quick comment also, which is that I couldn't agree more with Dr. Pally about and the challenges that we have, but it's in every aspect of care. It's not just in primary care. And there's a policy and reimbursement issue here, which we should not forget and deserves a lot of attention. There are not enough genetic counselors in the country that are being trained. It's a wonderful profession, and I encourage some of our young mentees to think about it. But the simple fact is there's not enough. There is telegenetics, but patients are not sufficiently equipped to keep their appointments, sometimes in person, and certainly even more so with telegenetics if it's a first visit. The providers are not trained enough, even in oncology, to deliver this. So we need, number one, to get reimbursement for genetic counselors and for genetic consults, which tend to be long and complex, as has been said, and also involves the family, which you may not even be directly taken care of, another barrier. And there has to be policy around creating a structure that allows reimbursement of individuals that have not had a say in this in the past and fall outside the traditional reimbursement structure, to be honest.
Susan, can I just make a comment? If anyone hasn't read Mukherjee's books, Cancer, the Emperor of All Maladies, and The Gene, if some people on this call, they are terrific. They're written with a layperson in mind, and I'd highly recommend reading the books, or PBS has done some shows as well. Mukherjee does a great job of describing the development of the autobiography of the gene, as it were. Right, Dr. Schwartzberg?
Absolutely, great books, and I recommend it to everyone. Great.
And I would second that as a non-science literate person. I wholeheartedly.
Great book.
Excellent.
I just want to pile on for 1 minute. I agree with everything that was said. I run a small foundation that funds scientists, and I talk to parents all day long. I'm dealing with the world's experts in my gene. And with all due respect to them, sometimes I find myself in amazing conversations where they're correcting each other on the finer points of certain terms. And it's always mind-blowing to me where if my scientists can't even get aligned on words we throw around pretty regularly, how on earth are we going to cascade this through the clinical community? And then I talk to the parents, and it's a totally different conversation. You have to use, when we say we need to educate the clinicians, then we need to educate the parents. I want to make the point that one does not just repackage that material. One doesn't just use a thesaurus and use smaller words. It's, and I'm the lay non-scientific parent, it's an entirely different framing of the material and the implications, sensitive to both the person's sense of urgency, they have a sick kid in their other arm, and their emotional readiness to hear certain things. So, one genetic counseling appointment does not do the trick. You need another one 3, 6, and 12 months later after you're able to actually hear things. So how we leverage and partner with the patient community to deliver ongoing support, I think, is critical. But this idea that I like the AI point, because a tear sheet that is current on the gene, the disease, the whatever, that every clinician can reference and speak from, that is constantly available publicly, I think is essential. But at the same time, another tear sheet for the families so that they can push the conversations when the clinicians either don't have time or aren't read up, I think is also important. Because for communities like mine, where there isn't something today that's going to be in 3 years or 5 years, whatever, the amount of explaining that I do is amazing to me. And I think we have to constantly be trying new models for educating both the clinicians and the parents, because people are all struggling in at different levels. Sorry if I'm talking too much.
No, you're not talking. Matter of fact, you made some great points in terms of having that conversation more than once. Because I remember when I was diagnosed with colon cancer, they told me I had Lynch syndrome, but no one ever followed up with me as to what that meant. No one educated me as to it. I had to go and find out what Lynch syndrome actually meant and what it meant for my children. And, and again, it also speaks to, where a patient receives their care and who's giving it to them, because you also have to realize that there's still implicit bias, people that may judge a patient based upon, their experience, life, and walk. And so no one elaborated more on what, I was 35 years old and had no idea what Lynch syndrome was. And they sent me home. No one told me what the genetic testing, was going to be done. It took me 11 years to realize that Lynch syndrome, wasn't good for me, but it also wasn't good for my children. I had to fight to get them tested and find out where I needed to get resources to test my children under a certain age. So you are absolutely correct. The conversation needs to be ongoing, and it also needs to have an exchange where that the conversation is saying, did you understand what I said? Do you need more clarification? What other information can we schedule an appointment so that you can come in and let's talk about what was shared? Not so much that you're coming back for a physical appointment, but an appointment to come back for the discussion of what was shared.
And what are the next steps for you, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that would be an important. Jennifer, you wanted to make a comment about encouraging patients to ask about genetics. Could you weigh in here for a minute?
Yeah, absolutely. And I also agree with the previous comment about all of the discussions that we're talking about today that happen between a clinician and a patient are ideally not one-time discussions. They're discussions that evolve over time. But more globally, I wanted to encourage us to think about the guiding principles that Susan reviewed as we review these research questions. The first of which addresses the idea that people have different desires when it comes to the amount and type of information they want. And so while we can certainly make information available online or through patient advocacy organizations, some people find hope in maintaining a certain level of uncertainty. And that might be something that's hard for many of us to grasp, because many of us are people who think more information is better, and sometimes it is. But it can be very overwhelming for patients and families to make sense of complicated information, as we have discussed. But more information may not always be better, especially if information is sometimes contradictory. I would also encourage us to think about that patients may not want to ask questions about genetics because they might view something that is genetic in nature as something that has a sense of finality or something that can't be changed. And so I think we want to be really thoughtful about how we might structure our research questions and any advice or materials that surround those questions, to acknowledge that not only are we thinking about personalized medicine, but people have personalized needs and wants when it comes to their health-related information.
That's a great comment.
That's great. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, you go ahead. That's fine.
No, I was just going to make what she said was spot on. And so with my foundation, and I'm a patient advocate and a patient, and I also run a foundation. And in my foundation, we have a saying: family secrets kill families. And as much as we believe that, yes, it is your personal business. Yes, you may not want to deal with it, but the reality of it is what you don't share has the ability to kill your family later on. And so what we try to do is encourage them to, if they don't want to know the information, have a family member with them that might be able to receive the information so that they can share with the other family members, not disclose their personal business, but to also have that information so that once and then we also bring the human component to it. Look at your grandchildren. Look at your children. So would you want them to have, the best opportunity to live life because they are prepared, or their lives cut short because you didn't share the information or because you don't want to, to expose that? And so when we bring that human component, it allows them to look at things in a different way. Of course, it's not an instantaneous, reaction, but it does give that patient something to think about, that, oh, wait a minute, you know what? This does have the ability to, kill my family lineage. And so it's just giving them another way of thinking about it, but also letting them know too that, you know what, you don't have to absorb it all today, but have the opportunity to think it over and think of how it's going to affect your family.
Yeah, that's a great comment. And, I remember we've got cancer all over my family. And when I asked my mom to get genetic testing done, she really didn't want to, because she didn't want to think about the fact that she may have given her children, a predisposition to cancer. It was like a shame and a guilt issue. So I think it is one that's really complicated. I know that Richard Knight, you're on the call, and you have done some really great work in the kidney space in terms of provider and patient education. I was going to speak to that if you are on. I think you are.
Yes, I am. Thank you very much, and certainly find this call to be very exciting. Again, I'm Richard Knight. I'm president of the American Association of Kidney Patients. And as you said, our role is to educate and advocate. And one of the things that we do by way of education, it's important that, and I agree with my colleague earlier who was a patient, and just to add on to what she was saying, it's important that we look at patients as individuals. And there are some patients that want to know information and some who do not. But I would say this: I think the more that they get educated and have a comfort level about topics such as this, the more that they will choose to engage and learn more. So not only do we educate patients, but we also have to educate healthcare providers, particularly as it relates to doing the types of things that would engage some of the people who typically aren't involved in clinical trial research, minority populations, and things of that nature. Not really anything different, but maybe reaching out to some different groups. And we do have some diseases that pass from generation to generation, and we hold conferences and we talk about these types of things, and we have more people than you realize who will come out and want to know the information. I think the challenge is to be able to communicate with the patient in a manner in which they are comfortable, and also to have that, to do the type of things that will allow you to develop the trust level with the patients. We always have to deal with the elephants in the room. That's some things that have happened that haven't had very good outcomes for certain patient populations. So we want to deal with that, assure people that we have their best interests in heart, and take the eye off of them. And as I believe it was Candace who said earlier, talk about your children and generations to come, and how you might be able to make it available for them to have a much better life. And I think in that regard, many patients will be much more forthcoming. Thank you.
Thanks. Margie, did you want to share something? I know Laura Holmes Haddad, you said that you wanted to add a comment. So take it away.
I did. I just wanted to add, Candace started that conversation about being 35 and diagnosed with cancer and having children. And what I just want to add is that how can we ensure that the genetic counseling conversations are continuing as we are facing these issues of testing our children? As most of you know, I was diagnosed at 37. I have 2 children. I'm BRCA2 positive. And the implications of these genetic questions on our children, obviously in my case, I'm very concerned about my daughter and the implications that that could have on her childbearing and other issues. And I think we just really need to bring that into the conversation, particularly as there are so many more younger cancer patients that are parents, and that this is not going away, and that this needs to be brought in terms of an educational message and providers and nonprofits, as we were discussing before. So thank you.
Would anybody else like to comment? I mean, we're moving along, and this has been such a really great discussion. I did want to say, I started as, hey, we're going to go through these questions one at a time. Let's start with question one, but everybody's providing such great feedback that kind of flows through all of the questions that we're exploring here. So I would continue that to, tell you guys and encourage you.
Nothing worse than dead air.
No, it's gotten so polite and quiet. Have we opened it up to patient advocates?
Hello?
I mean, everybody at this point is able to chime in, whether you're patient advocate, a person from industry, etc.
Hello, this is.
We can hear you.
This is Terry. You can hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, Terry.
Okay. Hi, this is Terry Booker. I am a patient advocate. I have sickle cell disease, and I have a bunch of comments. Sickle cell patients have been doing personalized medicine before it was called personalized medicine, because by the nature of the disorder, I'll call it, we operate in such a way that we are not the same. So one thing that works for one sickle cell patient does not, in fact, work for another. And we have always had to advocate through either ourselves or a family or someone in order to receive treatment. So in accordance with that, I'll say our biggest hurdles have been with the healthcare professionals themselves. So making sure that when we tell a provider, hey, this is what works for us, or this is what we've been doing, or this is what's happening, that they are receptive to that advice, and they want to take that advice under strong consideration of their treatment plan for us, whether it be an emergency room or a regular plan for our care. Also, I agree with things that have been said about changes from the beginning, from med school, of learning about certain initiatives, the genetics, and I say sickle cell because it has been undereducated, and it's at almost every disease, or almost every doctor could possibly see a sickle cell patient, whether it's your kidneys, your eyes, your spleen, your bladder, etc. So I think there needs to definitely be changes with med school, and sickle cell is a genetic disorder. So by the nature of it, we have always been talking about our genes and who gave it to you, and your mom and your dad, and did your other family members have it? Did they know they had it? All of those sorts of things. So these are conversations that have been going on within the sickle cell community since I can remember. And I was diagnosed, I believe, at like 10, but now we have newborn screening. So I think it's a difference when you're born with something and you have to deal with it, and this is something that your parents are receiving, versus you receiving the information yourself as an adult. And I know last conversation they talked about transition to adult care, and those transition materials. So I think every part of personalized medicine
needs to take into consideration where you are. If you're receiving the information as a child or if you're receiving the information as an adult, and access care to the point of being able to even have the technology to have the ability to access the technology that we should most definitely be using to help with appointments and things like that, and giving out and distributing information so that patients don't feel necessarily pressured to make a decision right then. You can say, oh, you can go read it back on your whatever. I know in my hospital we have, it's called My Pen Medicine. So they have all your tests, all your everything. You can go back, look, see, ask questions, send emails, send a note, send whatever. But the thing is, even if you have those things, you have to make sure that people have access to technology in order to use that. If we could have something that maybe, and this is a dream of mine, to be able to have a system that if no matter where I am in the United States or the world, if a doctor has a question about my personalized care, it's something that they can log on to and say, oh, this is what's happening, this is what she's doing, this is how best to treat her. Also, as far as genetic testing and the discussion about genetic testing, it's so important that we definitely educate patients about just giving them the information, whether they understand or whatever. If it can at least start a conversation, that's how we grow. So if you can say, well, I don't understand genetics, or I don't know what this means, and it maybe doesn't have to be a physician conversation. It can maybe just be something that the nurse handles, or a genetic counselor within the office, or something like that, to try to help and cut costs, because if it's not a physician visit, it may not cost as much. Okay, I said a lot, so I still have some stuff to say, but I'll give it to someone else now.
You said a lot of wonderful things, actually. We're also getting a lot of great comments in the event chat. And Cynthia, I'm assuming that you're capturing all of those, and those are going to be incorporated.
Yeah, what we'll do is, I don't want to cut off the conversation because I think other people have some comments, but we will take the comments that we received and use it to help with our distilling, especially there were some specific additions to the questions that were helpful. And then we'll read them back at the final session and circulate them to everyone.
So who hasn't had a chance to speak up yet? And now is the time. We have about 15 minutes left for this conversation, and we would love to hear your feedback. So if somebody hasn't had an opportunity to chime in, this would be a great time to do so.
Okay, I'll add something to the scenario. In question 8, can we remove nurse practitioners and add social workers? Were you able to hear me? Can you hear me?
I hear you.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So question 8, instead of saying nurse navigators,
can you add social workers?
We can add them.
The nurse navigators are the same. They're both nurses. They can have different functions, but I think social workers should be added to the component.
Yep, we can certainly do that.
Thank you.
Can you hear me? This is Nadine.
Yep, we can hear you, Nadine.
Okay. So I just wanted to comment on the ongoing education of genetic counseling, in that we also love educating. I would love if I could see people who test positive, in particular VUSs, variants of uncertain significance, every year. How the health system currently works, basically genetic counseling is done to fulfill an insurance criterion, or to, that's why right now the model is pre-test counseling. And I actually totally agree that probably the pre-test counseling is not the ideal time to get all that information, because people are in a state where it's just very hard to take in all that information. And so I just want to reiterate, I think something Lee had mentioned about the reimbursement, and I do think it could fit maybe somewhere into this research agenda, that the education sessions are incredibly important, and even when we really want to do it, there's no way to get compensated for that. Phone calls that I'm on for an hour, none of it gets compensated. We've wanted to do like educational webinars for families, but like we can't figure out how to bill. And it's definitely a limitation, because then the hospital doesn't have an incentive to offer something like that. So I just wanted to mention that
Great point.
barrier that we face.
And it runs the gamut, right? Because when you think about all of the conversations patients are having with their healthcare teams, much of the time, these conversations, the educational component, the patient education piece, isn't reimbursable, right? So the doctor's not necessarily getting paid to have these conversations, and he or she has a 15-minute window to talk to each patient that they're seeing each day. So that's a big challenge, isn't it, Lee?
Yeah, it definitely is. One thing I would add that hasn't come up yet, I don't believe, was we're in an era now where telehealth and telemedicine is clearly going to be with us now, and it's one of the few silver linings we've seen from COVID-19, but it is a silver lining. There were a lot of barriers to this, and this changed overnight. And I can't think of a better use for telemedicine than the continuing education of patients with genetics, where it is a conversation. You don't need a physical exam frequently. And because these visits, at least at the moment, are billed either by complexity or by time spent, at least if you're a provider that can get reimbursed, this is a novel method. So I think you might put that into the research agenda as well, about how we can sustain the use of telemedicine as it relates to personalized medicine.
I have a statement. It seems as though the big thing is it's a financial hurdle to engage a patient on a more regulatory basis. What can we do to add patients' education into these budgets? Because the voice needs to be heard. And so we keep saying, okay, well, that's the problem. We know what the problem is. How can we resolve it? Who is voting on these budgets? Why don't patients have a voice within the budget? That's when some systematic change will happen, when the budget changes and patients are involved in that.
And I'd really like to add on that, because I was going to make a comment about it, because I continue to hear that no one is being compensated to educate the patients, and that's kind of concerning, because it seems to me that educating the patient should go hand in hand with a visit. And so if that means that patient for this visit gets educated about something else, then that's great. Add that to the next visit so that the patient is continued to be educating throughout their visits. So therefore, because I mean, it's like, it's kind of concerning to hear that I'm not being compensated about educating a patient. I mean, I thought that's the purpose of a visit, is to educate the patient. And then if money is an issue or compensation is an issue, like I stated before in my other comments, schedule a second follow-up visit to discuss, the education piece, so that that patient is knowledgeable about what's going on. You're sharing the information. You're getting paid because you're scheduling a visit. And if that means that we have to create, what is it called, ICD-9 codes, so that, the doctors are compensated. But I think to not educate a patient based upon finances is a disservice. And it's like, okay, how do we figure this out? But I think I think that shouldn't be the bottom line. And maybe because insurance companies, and I get it, don't get me wrong, I'm not dinging anybody about that. So I totally understand your positions. I think the insurance companies have squeezed you all so much to the point where, and they've taken so much away, that it is coming to be like, okay, so how do we financially cover this and that? But I think at the bottom line, the patient is suffering between the doctors not being compensated and the insurance company squeezing the hell out of you. But I think at some point, the patient's best interest has to be at the forefront.
And it couldn't
So if I can,
Go ahead, Grace.
Yeah, so what I was going to say is one of the things we've been looking at is the use of billing codes and other incentives in the Medicare and Medicaid program to encourage that type of education and training of people and family members. So I think from a research question, and we're doing it on the regulatory side, but understanding where these incentives exist, such as oncology and how they're being used or not used. The other big place is long-term post-acute care. And there are other sort of policy levers. So I think understanding those, when you talk about barriers, that part of that is the regulatory reimbursement barrier. The other thing is just recognizing that not everyone is going to receive education in the right way, or not the right way, but in the same way. So in the chat box, I mentioned Dr. Pamela Hines, who's a researcher who's done a lot of work in pediatric, terminal, and rare diseases. And her work at Children's National included sort of developing guides for clinicians to understand how to talk to people at different stages of the care journey. And I think that's really important because one of the challenges is I think we're asking a lot of clinicians to put the onus on them to do all of this education. And so equipping healthcare professionals with the tools that they need in order to have thoughtful conversations and to refer out to people like social workers who have been trained in how to have those kinds of conversations, I think is really important.
That's great. And Tina Whitney, could you speak to that? Because I know that you said in your comments that you cover genetic counseling and do not have it as a requirement for testing. So could you speak to that for a minute?
So I know I'm on for Friday to talk a little more about the financials, but this has been very interesting that it happened today. And we have many policies for genetic testing right now. We're an insurance company based in Massachusetts. We're very fortunate to be part of the Boston healthcare community. We used to have a requirement for genetic counselors before anybody went for genetic testing, but to some of the points today, it probably was too soon. So we've removed that requirement. People can still get it, and people can still get genetic counseling. So just to let people know, we are also constantly revising our policies to cover the new genetic testing, but we're also a health plan. So when you talk about fiscal responsibility, when you talk about fixing budgets, when you talk about finance, all of this costs money. All of this research costs money. And the insurance companies aren't the banks to pay for it. So we need to be responsible enough so that people can afford insurance. That's what we're here for. So I think you have to take that balance into consideration with not just genetic testing, but all the new medical policies, procedures that are coming out. We have to be responsible for this. We also have contracts with providers that are value-based contracts. So they're not fee-for-service. We don't pay for providers to do testing and this, that, and the other thing. We pay for them to give comprehensive care to our members. And they have a budget to do that. And a lot of the providers in the Massachusetts area do that. So to hear that they're not getting paid to do education, not even just for genetic testing, education for chronic care, education for anything, is kind of a misnomer. I know primary care physicians are overworked. I know they don't know a lot about the genetic testing right now. I know we've been doing some pilots with some of the genetic providers in the state and trying to educate the physicians. So I know all of these things you're saying are true, but you have to understand, I don't know who actually pays for all of this. And it's a really good question. But if you have the insurers like us who are nonprofit, we can't pay for it because we don't want to have you pay for it, for your insurance premium. So anyway, that's my spiel.
Tina, I'd like to add to what you're saying. This is Richard, and I'm with a group that part of the challenge is that we have to re-envision how healthcare is paid for. Many of us still have a fee for service mentality. I know they say the words about value based, but again, if we focus on patient outcomes, there's plenty of money in the system for education. The question is, who's getting the money and how effective are they? That's where patient outcomes is involved.
Absolutely.
Because again, I've had to say this to many physicians. And I say, I understand that, but if we're looking at patient outcomes, it makes sense for you to educate that patient because you want to save money further down the road when they don't do what you want them to do because they really don't understand. The physicians are, particularly primary care physicians, are pressured to do that volume thing, as we say. We have to move beyond that. And again, we have to educate the patients to have more effective role as an organization. We may have made 500 visits up on Capitol Hill with doctors, making the point of how we can change some of these challenges that are put in place, particularly as the doc mentioned about telehealth. You know, when you make a phone call, you can only get paid X amount of dollars, but they've amended that rule so that if you go ahead and do it the other way, you can get paid a little bit, you can get reimbursed a little bit more instead of on increments of 15, 28, 40 something minutes. So there's a lot of change that's taking place. And as a community, we have to really keep our eye on the ball because at the end of the day, we have to measure patient outcomes.
Absolutely. 100% I agree with you.
The effectiveness of what's going on. So,
and I also want you to know, I'm a nurse. I'm a care manager, and I've worked in many different clinical settings and provider settings. And so just so you know, I have that clinical background as well. And I agree with you 100% with the outcomes.
But you know what, it's important also that we know that with low income communities, and these are the communities in which I serve, this conversation, access and information, this is not even being had. And so what we're talking about right now is on a higher level of where patients have access and where the hospitals and the clinics that they serve, they have access. So what about those patients that don't have access? What's available for those patients that are on Medicaid? You know, what's available for the patients that are receiving, they're getting insurance off the market exchange, but yet, you know, they're piecing it together because they can't afford certain things from the insurance that they chose. So I think when we're talking about this, it's much bigger, and then we have to kind of look at it in a totally in a bigger picture, you know, because we're leaving a whole other group of people out.
Yeah. And again, in Massachusetts, it's a little ahead of the curve, and they've done a nice job with their Mass Health product, and they've made it a value-based contract here in Massachusetts. So to your point, Massachusetts is probably a little ahead of the curve on that.
Susan, you know, the COVID epidemic has been disruptive to healthcare provision in this country, and when it retreats a little bit, less care will be given by telemedicine, but genetics is an area that should not be permitted to retreat because, as our GCs have said on the call, a lot of care, sometimes an hour or more of phone discussions, are being handled by genetic counselors in both education and in diagnostics. And that's something that needs to be, this group needs to recommend that telemedicine with telegenetics be a critical piece of the future of healthcare provision. That does not require so much as hands-on like abdominal pain, earaches, et cetera, which, you know, primary care physicians like myself have to handle. Telegenetics is critical. Thank you.
This is Nadine, and I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention genetic counselors are nearly always not recognized clinicians by their hospitals, which is why a lot of this billing stuff comes up. The patient's billed for the MD visit, not
Incident two, right, Nadine?
Yeah, like I can charge a facility fee, like, okay, we used an hour of this facility, so we can, I don't know, charge like $20 because you sat in the waiting room and we used lights. But right now there's a bill trying to get passed. Like, genetic counselors are constantly trying to advocate for our profession and that we're useful and that we like enhance outcomes, because a lot of times hospitals don't want to spend money on a genetic counselor salary that doesn't actually bring in the same amount of money. We basically lose the money, lose the hospital money. So a lot of times we have to like convince places, or our departments end up convincing them to set aside some money for a genetic counselor. But part of this is because we're not like recognized, we're not certified by our institutions. There might be 1 or 2 institutions in the country where they're certified. So advocacy for genetic counselors is very much needed.
And what bill is that?
All of these.
HR 665, I think. I can look it up quickly.
And while Nadine's looking it up, I just want to say that this conversation has been incredible. And I think all of your feedback and suggestions and your comments are going to flow really well into the next session, which is about disrupting the healthcare system for personalized medicine. And so I hope you will join us for that session as well. And I know that there will be a summary of this session that everybody will get, right, Cynthia? And that will be addressed at the beginning of the next session.
Yes. Yep, we'll give a recap, and we'll also, we took all the comments down about prioritization and wordsmithing, and we'll try to incorporate some of those in advance of Thursday and share them with you. But thank you. This has been wonderful and incredibly helpful.
Nadine, did you find your you were looking for?
Yeah, it's HR 3235.
Great. Well, on that note, we are going to end because we have run out of time. But thank you so much, everyone, for joining this discussion, and we will see you in a few days.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.